Pain has a way of spreading when nobody cares to stop it. Summer 1856, deep in the red Georgia dirt, a young enslaved woman named Elsie lay dying by a muddy pond. Her ribs heaved with every ragged breath. Blood stained her torn dress. The coughing had started weeks ago. The fever that came and went like a cruel joke. She knew what this meant. She'd seen it before. Watched people fade day by day until even lifting a bucket felt impossible. Her lungs squeezed tighter. Each breath scraped raw. Iron flooded her mouth. When she coughed, red splattered the ground. Something inside was breaking. Elsie was barely 20, but forced labor had carved wisdom into her young eyes. She'd been born here on Fairview Plantation, a name that sounded elegant over fine china but meant death without memory to those in the quarters. The owner, Charles Whitfield, built his fortune on sugar, cotton, and bodies. His wife Marianne moved through the estate like a queen, whose crown was woven from suffering. Pale, powdered skin, soft hands that never worked. But her eyes held an icy detachment, a bored cruelty that made people flinch when she passed. That afternoon, Marianne's buggy rolled along the path between fields and pond. She wanted escape from the stifling heat inside the mansion. Isaac, an older enslaved man, kept his eyes forward as coachman, every muscle tense. Beside Marianne sat her younger sister Lydia, visiting from Savannah, always watching, always curious. "Stop," Marianne commanded suddenly. Isaac pulled the reins. The horse snorted. Marianne had spotted something out of place on her perfect property. A girl curled near the water's edge, shoulders jerking with shallow breaths. To Marianne, this wasn't concern. It was an offense. "What is that girl doing?" Marianne's voice cut like ice water. Isaac swallowed hard. "Ma'am, that's Elsie. She's been sick. Overseer said—" "I did not ask what the overseer said." Marianne's interruption was sharp. "I asked what she is doing." Lydia leaned forward, squinting. "She looks like she's dying." The word drifted across the heavy air and settled like dust. Something tight flickered in Marianne's chest. Annoyance, not pity. Dying where anyone could see, as if misery had forgotten its place. "Get up," Marianne called out, lifting her dress hem as if Elsie's sight might stain it. Elsie heard the voice before seeing the face. Every nerve wanted to obey, to prove she was still useful. She pushed with her arms, tried rolling to her knees. Pain sliced through her chest, vision blurred. Sound grew distant, underwater. She collapsed back with a strangled gasp. Marianne watched her fall like watching an animal fail a trick. Her lips curled. "They grow so lazy when they think they're about to leave this world," she said with a light laugh to Lydia. "Even death becomes an excuse." Lydia shifted uncomfortably. The laugh sounded wrong, even to her. It echoed against still water, bitter and sharp. Elsie heard it too. The laughter slid into her bones like a blade. Somewhere beneath the crushing weight of sickness, beneath years of orders and blows and swallowed screams, something ancient stirred. She lay there, cheek pressed to dirt, blood and grit mixing on her tongue. Her heart stuttered, each beat slower than the last. The world narrowed to burning lungs and distant voices above. But then, another sound rose in her memory. Her grandmother's voice. Not the grandmother given by ledgers and sale papers, but the one remembered through stories. A woman stolen from a village across the ocean long before Elsie's birth. Her mother had repeated those stories in the darkest corners of night, when the overseer slept and stars felt like watchful eyes. "Blood remembers," her mother would whisper while braiding Elsie's hair. "They can chain your body, child, but your spirit runs deeper than their fields." Your grandmother knew the old ways. She spoke to rivers, to ancestors, to spaces between breaths, heard her children, and the world itself might turn against you. As a girl, Elsie had clung to those stories like a secret talisman, but stories didn't stop whips, didn't stop children being sold. By 16, her faith had thinned to something fragile and distant. Life on Fairview crushed hope like it crushed bodies, slowly, efficiently. Yet as she lay dying, listening to white laughter float above her, the stories didn't feel distant at all. They felt close, pressing in, waiting. Elsie tried to speak and choked instead. A cough tore from deep in her chest, racking her body. Warm liquid flooded her mouth. When it spilled onto the ground, dark and red, Lydia's hand flew to her throat. "Marianne, she's really not well. Perhaps we should send for..." "For what?" Marianne's irritation sharpened. "A doctor for her? The doctor is for the house. They have each other. They are not my concern when no longer of use." Isaac's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. He knew better than to speak when white anger simmered so close to surface. He stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on a distant tree, forcing himself not to look at Elsie. Marianne motioned with a wrist flick. "Isaac, get her on her feet. If she dies, she will not do it here where I have to look at her." Isaac hesitated just a breath too long. Marianne's gaze snapped to him. He climbed down, knees protesting as he landed. Slowly, he walked to Elsie's side, his shadow falling over her. Her eyes fluttered open, cloudy with pain. For a moment, their gazes locked. Two people bound by chains, one visible, one invisible. "Child," he whispered, barely moving his lips. "Try. Please. If you don't, she'll..." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. He slipped his hands under her arms, feeling her startling lightness. Always thin, but now almost hollow, as if sickness had eaten her from inside out. He lifted as gently as possible. Her feet dragged in dirt. For a brief second, she stood, swaying, head drooping. Marianne watched, unimpressed. She looks like a drunkard. Imagine, too weak to hold herself up, yet strong enough to waste a whole afternoon with this performance. The laugh came again, soft, disdainful, cold. It washed over Elsie like a wave of fire. Something in her snapped. Her knees buckled. She sagged in Isaac's arms. He lowered her back to the ground before she tore free and collapsed completely. She rolled onto her back this time, staring up at white sky. The edges of her vision darkened, closing in like curtains drawing shut. She knew this feeling, the bridge between this world and whatever waited beyond. Her breath came in thin, ragged threads, but between one shallow gasp and the next, a strange calm settled over her. The pain didn't leave, but changed. Sharper, clearer, focused. It felt as if all her suffering, all her humiliation, all the nights she'd cried silently into thin blankets while her body ached from labor were gathering into one burning point inside her chest. The stories, her grandmother, the old ways. Elsie's lips moved at first without sound. Isaac leaned closer, thinking she was asking for water, for help, for something he couldn't give. Then slowly, the words arrived. Not in English, but in a cadence older than the plantation, older than Marianne's family name, older than the country itself. The syllables came in broken fragments, inherited through whispers, incomplete, yet potent. Marianne stiffened. "What is she saying?" Lydia asked, voice small. Isaac's throat tightened. He recognized the rhythm even if he didn't know every word. The rhythm of prayers said over unmarked graves, of songs hummed into children's ears to keep old memories alive. It's nothing, ma'am," he said quickly. "Just talking. Foolish fever talk." But the fever felt like something else to Elsie. As she spoke, her voice grew clearer. The language was a patchwork of memory. Some words correct, some guessed, some replaced with English, but the intention behind them ran strong and pure. Her hands, weak just moments before, clawed at the air, fingers curling as if pulling invisible threads together. "In the name of those taken from the water and the land," she whispered, eyes wide, staring up at a sky that suddenly seemed much closer. "In the name of those who cried and no one listened. Hear me." Marianne shifted in her seat, irritation flickering into unease. "Make her stop. I do not want that noise on my land." But Isaac couldn't make her stop. No one could. The words had taken hold. Elsie's voice gained strange power, thin but clear. "You laugh," she said, still staring at the sky, though everyone knew who she meant. "You laugh while I die. You laugh at my pain. You laugh at the work that broke my body. You laugh at the blood in my mouth. You laugh at my life like it is nothing." Marianne's fingers dug into her dress fabric. "She is delirious," she said sharply. But the brittle edge in her tone betrayed something else. Lydia's gaze darted between her sister and Elsie, caught in a fear she couldn't name. "You laugh," Elsie repeated, voice cracking but unyielding. Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes, sliding into her hairline. "So, let your laughter be taken. Let your joy turn to ashes. Let your sleep be full of the faces you never saw as human. Let the sound of your own voice bring you no comfort." The air seemed to thicken around them. The slight breeze that had rustled cane stalks moments earlier stilled, leaving the field in breathless silence. Even insects seemed to pause, as if the world itself were listening. Elsie took another shuddering breath. The burning point in her chest flared, then began spreading outward as if every nerve in her body were catching fire. She clung to the heat, poured her rage and grief into it, shaping it with the last of her will. "By my blood," she whispered, barely audible now, "and by the blood of my mother and her mother and all who died with no one to speak for them." Her eyes rolled slightly, but she forced them back, focusing, anchoring herself in this final act. "I bind you, Marianne Whitfield. As you have made others beg, so shall you beg. As you have watched others suffer without mercy, so shall your heart be broken. Your hands will itch with helplessness. Your eyes will know tears, and you will call for help and find none, not even in your own house." The last word came out on a breath that sounded more like a sigh than a sentence. Her chest rose once, twice. Then, with a long, rattling exhale, it stilled. Silence crashed down over the pond. For a few seconds, no one moved. Lydia's lips parted, but no sound came. Isaac knelt frozen, hands still hovering inches above Elsie's limp shoulders. The world felt oddly distant, as if they were all standing inside a glass jar and someone had sealed the lid. Marianne was the first to break the stillness. She scoffed, though the sound rang slightly hollow. What nonsense! She wasted her last breath on foolish threats. But she couldn't quite shake the prickling at the back of her neck. The sensation of having been watched by something she couldn't see and didn't believe in. Isaac bowed his head over Elsie's body, murmuring a soft prayer under his breath. He didn't understand exactly what she had done, but he felt the weight of it. He had heard stories whispered at night, stories of words that lingered after death, of curses born not out of superstition, but out of desperation so deep it tore open the fabric between this world and the next. "Take care of that," Marianne said, gesturing vaguely at Elsie's direction, as if she were talking about trash that needed clearing. "Bury her somewhere appropriate and make sure the others do not see her like this. They grow too attached to their own tragedies." She snapped open a small fan and flicked it lazily. "Come, Lydia, we are losing the day to this spectacle." Lydia hesitated. "Marianne, what if what?" Marianne interrupted, voice tight. "What if what she said? What if it does something?" Marianne let out a short, harsh laugh. "Do you truly believe a dying slave girl has power over me? You have been reading too many Gothic novels. This is the real world, Lydia. Power is money, land, and law. It is not muttered gibberish in the mud." She gestured sharply to Isaac. "Do as you are told." Isaac nodded silently, eyes never leaving Elsie's face. Her expression in death was strangely peaceful, as if she had finally laid down a burden far heavier than her frail body. As the buggy wheels turned and rolled away, carrying Marianne and Lydia back toward the mansion, the sound faded into distance, leaving only the creak of leather harnesses and faint rustle of cane leaves. When they were gone, Isaac let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Child," he whispered to Elsie's still form, "whatever you called, I pray it finds its way." His voice trembled. "And I pray it don't burn us with it." He gathered a few fallen reeds and laid them gently over her hands, a small gesture of respect in a world that offered so little. From the field, a few enslaved workers had paused in their labor, squinting toward the pond. They had seen the buggy stop, seen Isaac lift and lower a limp shape, seen the white mistress's rigid posture against the sky. They didn't need details to know what had happened. On plantations like Fairview, death rarely arrived as a surprise. It came like an old visitor, familiar, unwelcome, but never unexpected. Still, something about this death felt different. As whispers began to snake through the rows of cane. "Elsie gone. She died by the water. She said something at the end?" A new note threaded itself through the usual mix of sorrow and resignation. Fear, yes, but also something else. A low, uneasy anticipation, as if the entire plantation had taken a breath and was waiting, without knowing why, for something to change. Back at the big house, Marianne stepped down from the buggy with practiced grace. Servants rushed forward to assist with her packages, her parasol, the small details of her comfort that defined their lives. She moved through the front doors into the cool shadow of the hallway, the polished wood floors and grand staircase welcoming her like an old friend. Here, surrounded by portraits of Whitfield's long dead and furniture imported from across the ocean, she felt the full weight of her status. Whatever had happened by the pond was already receding in her mind, shrinking into a minor inconvenience in an otherwise ordinary day. Yet when she passed the large mirror in the foyer, something made her glance at her reflection. Her face, carefully arranged into its usual controlled expression, stared back. But for a brief, flickering instant, she thought she saw something else in her eyes. A shadow, a doubt, a hairline crack in the glass of her certainty. She dismissed it with an impatient tilt of her chin and climbed the stairs. Behind her, far from the polished floors and framed paintings, the earth around the pond held the last warmth of Elsie's body. The words she had spoken seemed to cling to the air, invisible and persistent. They did not vanish with her last breath. They hung there like smoke that refused to disperse, waiting for a wind strong enough to carry them into the heart of the house that had broken her. The curse had been spoken. The woman who laughed at a dying slave believed herself untouchable. She was wrong. The first night passed without incident. Marianne slept soundly in her feather bed, wrapped in linens imported from France, breathing slow and even beneath a canopy of white lace. The house settled into familiar rhythms, the soft creak of old wood cooling, distant cricket chirps through open windows, occasional shuffle of a house servant moving quietly through darkened hallways. Nothing seemed different. Nothing felt wrong. But change doesn't always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives in whispers, in small disturbances so subtle they're mistaken for coincidence. A door that won't latch properly, a candle that flickers and dies despite no draft, a sensation of being watched when you're alone in a room. These are the tremors before the earthquake. The first drops before the storm breaks open the sky. Marianne woke the next morning with a faint headache pressing behind her eyes. She blamed it on the heat, the long afternoon ride, perhaps the wine at dinner. She rang the small silver bell on her nightstand, summoning Ruth, her personal maid, who had learned to anticipate her mistress's needs with the precision of someone whose survival depended on it. Ruth entered quickly, eyes lowered, hands already moving to open the heavy drapes and let in morning light. "Good morning, ma'am," she said softly. Marianne didn't respond. She rarely did. Acknowledgement was a kindness she didn't waste on servants. She sat up slowly, pressing fingers to her temples. "Bring me tea, and tell cook I want eggs properly done this time. Not that runny mess from yesterday." "Yes, ma'am." Ruth moved toward the door, but paused when Marianne spoke again. "That girl who died yesterday. What was her name?" Ruth's shoulders tensed slightly. "Elsie, ma'am." "Elsie." Marianne repeated the name as if tasting something bitter. "She has been buried?" "Yes, ma'am. Last night. Isaac and some of the field hands took care of it." "Good." Marianne waved her hand dismissively. "Make sure the others do not linger over it. Grief slows work, and we cannot afford delays during harvest season." Ruth nodded, her face carefully blank. She had learned long ago not to let emotion show in front of Marianne Whitfield. But as she left the room and descended the back stairs toward the kitchen, her hands trembled slightly. She had heard the whispers spreading through the quarters. Whispers about what Elsie had said before she died, about the strange heaviness in the air around the pond, about the way Isaac's face had looked when he returned from burying her. Ruth didn't know if she believed in curses, but she knew enough to be wary of dismissing them entirely. The world held too many mysteries, too much suffering that couldn't be explained by logic alone. Downstairs, the kitchen was already thick with heat and the smell of bread baking in the wide brick oven. Wooler, an older woman who had worked at Fairview longer than anyone could remember, stood over the stove stirring a pot of grits. Her broad shoulders moved with practiced efficiency. When Ruth entered, Bueller glanced up briefly. "She asking about Elsie?" Ruth nodded. "Just wanted to know if she was buried," Bueller grunted, turning back to the pot. "That woman got no heart. Child died right in front of her, and all she cared about is keeping the work moving." She shook her head slowly. "But Elsie, I heard what she did before she passed. Isaac told me." Ruth stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You think it was real, what she said?" Bueller's hand paused mid-stir. She stared into the bubbling pot as if searching for an answer in the swirling grits. "I think," she said carefully, "that when a person dies with that much pain in their heart and that much anger in their soul, something has to go somewhere. Don't just disappear like smoke. It lingers." A shiver ran down Ruth's spine despite the heat. She wanted to ask more, but the sound of footsteps above, Marianne moving across her bedroom floor, reminded her that she had tasks to complete. She gathered the tea service and a small plate of biscuits, balancing them carefully as she climbed back up the narrow servant stairs. When she re-entered Marianne's room, her mistress was standing at the window, staring out over the fields. The morning sun cast long shadows across the neat rows of sugarcane, painting the landscape in shades of gold and green. It was beautiful in the way that things built on suffering can still appear beautiful if you don't look too closely. "Your tea, ma'am," Ruth said quietly, setting the tray on a small table near the window. Marianne didn't turn. "Do you hear that?" Ruth paused, listening. She heard the usual sounds, birds calling from trees, distant voices of workers heading toward fields, the creak of the house settling. "Hear what, ma'am?" Marianne frowned slightly. "Nothing. Never mind." But something in her tone suggested she had expected to hear something specific and was disturbed by its absence. She turned away from the window and picked up the delicate porcelain teacup, bringing it to her lips. The tea was perfectly brewed. Hot, but not scalding, sweetened exactly as she preferred. Yet as she swallowed, a strange sensation crawled up the back of her throat. Not the tea itself, but something else. A tightness, a faint metallic taste that lingered on her tongue. She set the cup down with a sharp clink. "This tastes off." Ruth's eyes widened. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can make fresh—" "No." Marianne waved her off, irritation sharpening her voice. "Just leave it. Go." Ruth fled quickly, relieved to escape, before the irritation turned into something worse. Alone again, Marianne stood by the window, her fingers drumming restlessly against the sill. The headache had not improved. If anything, it was spreading. A dull, insistent pressure that seemed to wrap around her skull like a vice. She pressed her palm to her forehead, willing it away. From somewhere deep in the house, a door slammed. The sound echoed through the hallways, sudden and sharp. Marianne flinched, her heart skipping a beat. She waited, listening for footsteps, for an explanation, but none came. The house fell silent again, as if holding its breath. "Just the wind," she muttered to herself, though she knew there had been no wind strong enough to slam a door. The day unfolded slowly, each hour dragging under oppressive heat. Marianne tried to occupy herself with correspondence, writing letters to relatives in Charleston and Savannah, but the words came sluggishly. Her hand cramped around the pen. The ink seemed to smudge, no matter how carefully she wrote. Twice, she had to start a letter over because her usually elegant script came out shaky and uneven. By mid-afternoon, her frustration had curdled into something darker. She snapped at the housekeeper for a crooked curtain. She berated a servant for bringing her lemonade that was too warm. Every minor imperfection grated against her nerves like sandpaper. Yet beneath the anger was something she wouldn't name: unease. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of red and orange, Marianne sat in the drawing room with Lydia. Her sister had been quieter than usual all day, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the windows as if expecting to see something outside. As the shadows lengthened across the room, Lydia finally spoke. "Marianne, about yesterday, that girl by the pond." Marianne's jaw tightened. "What about her? The things she said before she died. Do you think, could there be anything to it?" Marianne let out a short, derisive laugh, though it sounded forced even to her own ears. "You cannot be serious." "I am not saying I believe it," Lydia said quickly, "but people talk about such things. Curses, hexes, old superstitions brought over from—" "Superstitions," Marianne interrupted sharply, "are for the ignorant and the weak-minded. That girl was delirious with fever. She spoke nonsense because her mind was failing along with her body. There is nothing more to it." Lydia looked down at her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Of course, you are right." But the words hung in the air, unconvincing. Marianne could see the doubt in her sister's eyes, and it irritated her more than the headache, more than the strange taste in her tea, more than the door that had slammed for no reason. Doubt was dangerous. It crept in like water through cracks, widening them, eroding certainty until everything felt unstable. "I am going to bed," Marianne announced abruptly, standing. "This heat has been unbearable." Lydia nodded, watching as her sister swept from the room, silk skirts rustling against polished floor. When Marianne was gone, Lydia sat alone in the drawing room, staring at flickering candles. Outside, the plantation settled into its night rhythms. The quiet murmur of voices from the slave quarters, the chirp of insects, the distant hoot of an owl. But beneath those familiar sounds, Lydia thought she heard something else. A faint whisper, barely audible, like breath moving through the walls. She shivered and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Upstairs, Marianne prepared for bed with Ruth's help, allowing the maid to unlace her corset and brush out her hair. The routine was familiar, grounding, a series of motions repeated so many times they required no thought. Yet tonight, every touch felt wrong. The brush caught in her hair. The nightgown felt too tight around her throat. When Ruth finally left and closed the door softly behind her, Marianne climbed into bed and lay staring at the canopy above her. Sleep did not come easily. She tossed and turned, the sheets tangling around her legs. Every time she closed her eyes, strange images flickered behind her eyelids. The face of the dying girl by the pond, her lips moving in that incomprehensible language, the dark stain of blood on the ground, the way the air had seemed to thicken and press down like a weight. Marianne forced her eyes open, shaking her head as if to dislodge the images. "Foolishness," she whispered into the darkness, but the darkness did not answer. Hours passed. The candle on her nightstand burned lower, wax pooling at its base. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed midnight. Marianne was still awake, her heart beating a little too fast, her skin prickling with a sensation she couldn't name. She told herself it was the heat, the humidity, the heaviness of summer nights in Georgia. Then she heard it. A sound, faint and distant like someone crying. It came from somewhere deep in the house, or perhaps outside, carried on the night air. Marianne sat up slowly, straining to listen. The sound came again, clearer this time, a soft, keening wail that rose and fell, mournful and broken. Her first thought was that one of the servants was mourning Elsie. That would explain it. Grief, unchecked and excessive, disrupting the night. She would have to speak to the overseer in the morning, remind him to keep better control over the quarters. But as the sound continued, something about it felt wrong. It was not coming from the direction of the slave quarters. It was closer, much closer. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves. Marianne's breath caught in her throat. She swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. For a moment, she considered calling for Ruth, but pride stopped her. She would not be the kind of woman who trembled at strange noises in the night. She crossed to the door and opened it slowly, peering into the darkened hallway. The sound had stopped. Silence pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. Marianne's hand tightened on the doorframe. She was about to retreat back into her room when she saw it. A flicker of movement at the far end of the hall near the top of the stairs. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, shaped almost like a person, but wrong somehow. Its edges blurred and shifting. Marianne's heart slammed against her ribs. "Who is there?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she felt. The shadow did not move, did not answer. It simply stood there, watching. For a long, breathless moment, Marianne could not move. Her entire body had gone rigid, her mind racing through explanations. A servant, a trick of candlelight, her own exhausted eyes playing tricks. Then the shadow turned and glided, not walked, but glided toward the stairs, disappearing down into the darkness below. Marianne slammed the door shut and pressed her back against it, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her hands were shaking. The headache that had plagued her all day flared into a sharp, stabbing pain behind her eyes. She stumbled back to the bed and sat on its edge, gripping the blankets as if they could anchor her to something solid and real. It was nothing, she whispered to herself. A shadow, a servant, nothing. But the words felt hollow. Somewhere in the house, the crying began again. Morning came slowly, dragging itself over the horizon like something wounded. Marianne had not slept. She had lain rigid in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around her. The crying had stopped eventually, fading into silence sometime before dawn, but the damage was done. Her nerves felt frayed, pulled tight as piano wire. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind through the windows had made her flinch. When Ruth knocked softly and entered with the morning tray, she found her mistress already awake, sitting by the window with dark circles carved beneath her eyes. Marianne's hair hung loose around her shoulders, unwashed and tangled. Her hands, usually so controlled and elegant, twisted restlessly in her lap. "Good morning, ma'am," Ruth said carefully, setting the tray down. She had learned to read Marianne's moods the way sailors read storm clouds, by the small signs, the subtle shifts in atmosphere that warned of danger ahead. Marianne did not respond immediately. She stared out at the fields, watching the first workers begin their long day under the rising sun. Finally, without turning, she spoke. "Did you hear anything last night?" Ruth hesitated. The question felt like a trap. "Hear what, ma'am?" "Crying. Someone crying in the house." Ruth's throat tightened. She had heard nothing from her small room off the kitchen, but she had felt something, a heaviness in the air, a sense of unease that had kept her awake longer than usual. "No, ma'am," she said quietly. "I didn't hear anything." Marianne's fingers stopped their restless movement. Her jaw clenched. "Of course you didn't." She stood abruptly, her nightgown swirling around her ankles. "Tell my husband I will not be joining him for breakfast. I have a headache." Ruth nodded and retreated quickly, grateful to escape the suffocating tension in the room. As she descended the stairs, she nearly collided with Lydia, who was coming up from the dining room with a troubled expression. "Ruth," Lydia said, catching her arm gently, "is my sister unwell?" Ruth chose her words carefully. "She said she has a headache, ma'am. She won't be down for breakfast." Lydia's frown deepened. "She has been acting strangely since yesterday. Distracted. Irritable." She lowered her voice. "Last night, I thought I heard something, like someone weeping. Did you?" "No, ma'am," Ruth said, perhaps too quickly. "I heard nothing." Lydia studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. Thank you, Ruth." As Ruth continued down to the kitchen, Lydia climbed the stairs toward her sister's room. She knocked once softly and opened the door without waiting for permission. Marianne was standing at the wash basin, splashing cold water on her face with shaking hands. When she looked up and saw Lydia in the mirror's reflection, her expression hardened. "I did not invite you in." "You look terrible," Lydia replied, ignoring the rebuke. She closed the door behind her and crossed the room. "What is wrong? And do not tell me it is just a headache. I know you better than that." For a moment, Marianne's carefully constructed mask slipped. Her shoulders sagged. She pressed her damp hands to her face, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter, almost vulnerable. "I heard something last night. Crying. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls." Lydia's breath caught. "I heard it too. I thought perhaps one of the servants—" "It was not the servants," Marianne snapped, the vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "It was something else. Something—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Lydia moved closer, her voice gentle. "Marianne, what that girl said before she died. What if—" "Do not." Marianne's voice was sharp as a blade. "Do not say it." "But what if it is real?" Lydia pressed. "What if she did something? What if she did nothing? Marianne's voice rose, echoing off the walls. She was a dying slave who spoke nonsense with her last breath. There is no curse. There is no magic. There is only... She stopped, her hands clenching into fists. There is only my household, and I will not allow superstition to disrupt it. Lydia fell silent, but the doubt remained in her eyes. Marianne could see it, and it infuriated her. Doubt was a disease, spreading from person to person, weakening resolve. She would not allow it to take root. "Leave me," Marianne said, turning away. "I need to dress." Lydia hesitated, then nodded. She left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Marianne stood alone in the morning light, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed almost like a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed, uncertain. Marianne forced herself to stand straighter, to lift her chin. She would not be broken by shadows and strange sounds. She would not give credence to the desperate words of a dying girl. But even as she thought it, a flicker of movement in the mirror's edge caught her attention. She spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed, except her. That evening, as twilight settled over Fairview, Marianne insisted on dining with the family, despite her exhaustion. She would not let anyone see weakness. Charles Whitfield sat at the head of the table, discussing business matters with a neighbor who had stopped by for dinner. The conversation flowed around Marianne like water around a stone. She heard it, but did not absorb it. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her fork. The food tasted like ash. Across the table, Lydia watched her sister with growing concern. The change in Marianne was undeniable now. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Her eyes darted nervously toward corners and doorways. When a servant entered to refill the wine glasses, Marianne flinched so visibly that Charles paused mid-sentence. "My dear, are you quite well?" he asked, his tone more irritated than concerned. A wife's illness disrupted the smooth functioning of his household, and Charles valued smooth functioning above nearly everything else. "Perfectly well," Marianne lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Simply tired." Charles studied her for a moment, then returned to his conversation, dismissing her discomfort as he dismissed most things that didn't directly affect his interests. Marianne felt a flash of anger. At him. At Lydia. At the servants moving silently around the table, at the entire world that continued as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. She felt it in her bones. After dinner, she retreated to the drawing room, while Charles and his guest retired to the library for cigars and brandy. Lydia followed her, closing the door softly. The two sisters sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of the mantel clock. "It is getting worse, isn't it?" Lydia finally said. Marianne's hands tightened on the armrests of her chair. "I do not know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Lydia leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Something is happening. Something that started when that girl died. You cannot keep pretending." "I am not pretending anything." But Marianne's voice lacked conviction. The exhaustion was catching up with her, eroding the walls she had built around her fear. Lydia reached out and took her sister's hand. Marianne was so surprised by the gesture that she didn't pull away. "Tell me what you have heard, what you have seen, all of it." For a moment, Marianne resisted. Pride warred with fear. Then, slowly, the words began to spill out. The crying in the night, the shadow in the hallway, the constant sensation of being watched, the way doors seemed to slam on their own, the taste of metal on her tongue that wouldn't go away, the dreams. She hadn't mentioned the dreams before, not even to herself, but now they came pouring out. Dreams of drowning in red water, dreams of hands reaching up from the earth, clawing at her ankles, dreams of Elsie's face, closer and closer, whispering words Marianne couldn't understand but felt in her marrow. When she finished, the silence in the room felt heavy as lead. Lydia's face had gone pale. "Marianne," she whispered, "we need to do something. We need to—" "What?" Marianne demanded, yanking her hand away. "What exactly should we do? Call a priest? Burn sage? These are the things slaves do, Lydia, not us. We are not—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "But what if it works?" Lydia pressed. "What if there are things we do not understand? things that do not fit into our neat, logical world. Marianne stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, darkness had fallen completely. The fields were invisible now, swallowed by the night. Only a few distant lights from the slave quarters flickered like dying stars. "If I acknowledge it," Marianne said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "if I admit that she had power, even in death, then everything I believe falls apart. Do you understand? Everything." Lydia rose and crossed to her sister's side. "Perhaps," she said gently, "it is already falling apart." Marianne closed her eyes. The headache was back, pounding behind her temples with renewed force. She felt so tired. Tired of fighting the fear, tired of maintaining the facade, tired of pretending the world made sense when it so clearly did not. A sound broke the silence. Footsteps, rapid and urgent, coming up the main staircase. Both women turned as the drawing room door burst open. Ruth stood in the doorway, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with panic. "Ma'am," she gasped. "You need to come now." Marianne's heart lurched. "What is it? What has happened?" It's your bedroom, ma'am. Something's wrong." The three women rushed up the stairs, Marianne's exhaustion forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. As they reached the second floor, Marianne could see that her bedroom door stood open, light spilling out into the hallway. Other servants had gathered nearby, their faces tight with fear. Marianne pushed past them and stopped dead in the doorway. Her room had been destroyed. Not violently. There were no broken windows, no overturned furniture, but systematically, methodically. Every drawer had been pulled open, its contents scattered across the floor. The bedclothes had been torn from the mattress and twisted into knots. The mirror above her vanity was cracked, a single fracture running diagonally from corner to corner. And on the walls, written in what looked like ash or soot, were words. The same strange words Elsie had spoken before she died, repeated over and over in cramped, desperate script. Marianne's legs gave out. She stumbled backward, caught by Lydia's arms. "No," she whispered. "No, this cannot." But it was. It was happening. Charles appeared at the end of the hallway, drawn by the commotion. "What in God's name?" He stopped when he saw the room, his face draining of color. For once, his usual bluster failed him. He simply stood there, staring. One of the older servants, a man named Samuel, who had worked at Fairview for decades, stepped forward. His voice was grave. "Mr. Whitfield, ma'am, this is old magic. The kind that don't let go easy." "Magic?" Charles sputtered, finding his voice at last. "There is no such thing as—" "Sir," Samuel's tone was respectful but firm. "I know what I know. And I know this. That girl who died, Elsie, she called something before she passed. Something that answered." Marianne felt the room spinning. She gripped Lydia's arms, nails digging in. "Make it stop," she whispered. "Please, make it stop." But no one answered, because no one knew how. If you enjoyed this story of justice, resistance, and the power of the powerless, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your engagement keeps these hidden histories alive.